But anyway, so one of the guys in today, his name is Paul Delacour. Paul's a graduate of mine, class of 1986. I'm really proud of Paul. I taught him history. He wrote a paper for me back in 1985. He brought it today. It was about J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. Today he talked about being an FBI agent. He's been one for 15 years. He was in the room when Saddam Hussein was being fingerprinted. And he's got lots of stories. The kids believe him. Listen to him carefully. The best part of what he talked about today to your sons was he said, you know, I wanted to be an FBI agent. He said, I went to law school. I went to U of M. I hope one day I get a chance. He said, it comes time for the interview. And the FBI interviewer says to me, he says, you know, we're going to do a polygraph. Yeah, he says, so why don't you tell us what you've done before we take the polygraph? Paul's a pretty nice guy. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, why don't you just tell him about, smoking dope when you're in high school? Paul says, I never did that. The guy says, you know, we're going to be on a polygraph. You lie, you're done. Paul says, I never did that. Takes the polygraph, obviously passes, flying colors, life is good. He says to the boy, he says, guess what? Decisions you make today have consequences. They can affect the rest of your life. And I watched 25 kids in that class, eyes wide, come up. And the guy, he looks like Jack Ryan. I'm telling you. Paul's a good-looking guy. He's got the gun. The kids, of course, can show you. Got the badge, the whole bit. He dressed up in the suit, the whole bit. And here's a guy standing up and saying, hey, Brother Rice, my parents taught me that. Brother Rice taught me that. By the time I was 18, I knew what was right and wrong. And here I guess he's 41 or 42 now, he says, and I lived my life defending this country, trying to do the right thing, having seen a lot more than many of you probably will ever see. Confident that I've at least been put in the right position, and I'm very grateful to Brother Rice for doing that. Well, of course, I sit back, I can tear you up. That's just the kind of message your sons want to hear. And they get that message time and again. They get it from their teachers. One of the best compliments I got last year was from a dad who was coming in to see me. He said, he decided he was going to stop in and see a couple teachers here who he knew. First one was a PE teacher who we went to school with. And he said he was just about to walk into class, and he stopped. And he said outside he could hear the guy talking about how important his marriage was, and how important it was that he was living a life of fidelity, that when he promised his wife that she would be the only one, that she's been the only one, and how many people make poor decisions in their life and are affected by temptation. And then went on to talk about, this PE class, the health implications, unfortunately, nowadays, of sexual infidelity and sexual disease. But that was his starting point. And then he says, he finally walked in, shook his hand, and just said, well, and then he walked off to another class. And as it turned out, the other guy he wanted to see was a biology teacher. He says he was just about to walk into that class, and he hears this guy saying, you know what, I saved myself for marriage. I think you all need to be conscious of the decisions you make now, what you might have to say to your future wife, or perhaps to your children at some point, and goes on this for a little while. And his head, he told me, he says, my head was spinning. And he waited for it to kind of finish to the right point. He came inside, shook his head, and he came up to me about 5 minutes later. He says, John, he says, I got to tell you something. Honestly, I just stopped in here to see a couple guys. I was completely blown away by what was here. And then he says, but then I started thinking about it. I thought, well, that's what I would expect. If you're trying to make men, you're trying to teach morality, if you're trying to raise young boys, you're trying to teach by example. And that example, just to backtrack here historically, just for a second, started, just to give you the quick history here, Edmund Rice was a father. Edmund Rice was a married man, very successful businessman back in the 1780s, over in Waterford, Ireland. His wife dies in childbirth. He goes through, as you can only imagine, the horror of being a widower, wondering what is going on. I think at the time, he was 28, maybe 29 at the time his wife died. Left with a handicapped child, he doesn't know what to do with it. Certainly didn't feel he was trained very well to take care of her various challenges. And literally goes on a 10-year prayer odyssey of God, what are you trying to do? What is the answer? What direction are you? What do you want me to do? And finally, essentially, at a period of time, comes to grips with the fact through his prayer that he's got to do something positive for the world. And he looks around, and he sees what he called the orphan boys of Waterford. Again, we see poverty here. I'm not sure that any of us can appreciate the kind of poverty that he saw that day. But most of the boys in that town who were Catholic were unbelievably poor, and many of them were orphans. And so he started a school in 1802, literally in a manger. I'm not sure if there was a biblical intent there for the metaphor, but in a manger. And he started teaching, and a couple guys joined him. After a week or two, they bailed. They weren't exactly trained in this. And he stood by and he prayed, and he eventually founded an order. He eventually founded schools that extended just out of Ireland throughout the world. Nowadays, if you don't know, there's 26 Christian Brothers schools in North America. One of them, for those of you who are graduates, run by Brother Mike Seglich in Rice High School in Harlem. Just doing a great job, 290 boys there, a great career. But it began, I want you to think about this, in 1802, Evan Rice didn't start a school and send kids to college. He started a school to change lives, to save lives, and transform lives. And not just by teaching them to read, though that was part of it, but by trying to show them that they were loved, that they had a purpose in life, that there was a difference between right and wrong, and that they had an opportunity, if they prepared themselves, to someday make a difference. That's 207 years ago, and I ask you, what's different than we're doing? It is the same essential mission. It's what makes us, I hate to use the word special, I feel that way, but I'd rather say it's unique. How many schools are concerned with the kind of person your son is being? I know you and your wife are. I know you care about that. I think back to my dad, now long deceased, and I can tell you, I remember the conversations. I've talked about this, I've written about it. What kind of man are you going to be? What difference are you going to make? Is the world going to be a better place or a worse place because you're here? Those are the kinds of things that are consistently talked about here, in the gym, on the football fields, in the classroom, in retreats, in Christian service, and I hope in an affirming way. Sometimes your sons are challenged. Sometimes they're told no, no matter what happens. But at the end of the day, I can tell you, one of the great highlights of my life the last 5 years is handing that diploma and shaking that hand and knowing that those boys, now men, understood that they had been a part of something special. A real part of what makes it special, I'll go back to the allowance, is the relationships, and forgive me, somebody mentioned it here a little bit earlier, the relationships that they form during their years at Brother Rice. For years I've been fascinated. I travel around. Hey, I got married 10 years ago. Here's a picture. 7 of the 8 guys at my wedding party are Rice guys. My 3 kids are godfathers of this. I mean, I hear that time and time again. By the way, if any of you want to speak to me the week after Thanksgiving, I'm a mess after Thanksgiving because that's when there are usually 8 or 9 Brother Rice reunions, that Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. I'm telling you, by Sunday I can't get Easter. But the great news is I've heard all these amazing stories again about the long-term relationships that guys have maintained, that special bond.